Operation Paperclip, Nazi scientists given U.S. citizenship. In the aftermath of World War II, the United States faced a new kind of war, the Cold War. With tensions mounting between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, both nations scrambled to acquire the brightest minds from Nazi Germany. The U.S. government, despite having just fought against the Third Reich, saw an opportunity to gain a technological edge, particularly in the fields of rocketry and weapons development. This led to Operation Paperclip, a highly secretive program aimed at recruiting German scientists, many of whom had been deeply involved with the Nazi regime. Under normal circumstances, these men would have been prosecuted for war crimes due to their affiliations with the Nazi Party and their involvement in military research that contributed to countless deaths. However, the U.S. military and intelligence agencies were more concerned about their expertise than their past. Hundreds of Nazi scientists, including Wernher von Braun, the architect of Hitler's 5-2 rocket program, were given safe passage to the United States. To smooth over legal and ethical concerns, their Nazi affiliations were either erased or downplayed in official documents. Many of these scientists were directly involved in horrific experiments or weapons production, but their knowledge was considered too valuable to lose. The secrecy surrounding Operation Paperclip was intense. The American public, still reeling from the atrocities of the war, would have been outraged if they knew that former Nazi officers were being welcomed into the country with open arms. Some of these men went on to play pivotal roles in major scientific advancements, including the U.S. space program. Von Braun, for instance, became a key figure at NASA, contributing to the development of the Saturn V rocket, which eventually sent humans to the moon. This clandestine operation was justified under the guise of national security, but it also raised moral questions. The same government that prosecuted Nazi war criminals at the Nuremberg trials was secretly giving others a free pass in exchange for technological expertise. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union conducted a similar program, leading to a silent but fierce race to absorb as much Nazi knowledge as possible. While Operation Paperclip undeniably advanced American science and military technology, it also revealed how quickly ethical lines could be blurred in the pursuit of power. The House of the Rising Mob, Mafia bosses. Freed for intelligence, during World War II, the United States faced a different kind of enemy, not just foreign powers, but also domestic threats lurking in its own underworld. With German U-boats lurking off the East Coast and fears of potential sabotage in major ports, the U.S. government turned to an unlikely ally, the Mafia. This led to an operation known as Operation Underworld, in which powerful mobsters were given early release in exchange for their assistance in securing American harbors. One of the most notable figures involved was Charles "Lucky" Luciano, one of the most infamous gangsters in U.S. history. Luciano, who had been sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison for running a massive prostitution ring, was approached by the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, in 1942. The U.S. government believed that the Mafia's control over the docks, particularly in New York, could be leveraged to prevent Axis espionage and sabotage. Luciano's influence extended through the powerful National Crime Syndicate, a loosely organized coalition of organized crime families. Through his connections, he was able to ensure that New York's ports remained secure, with Mafia enforcers monitoring for potential saboteurs. In return, Luciano was granted special privileges in prison, and after the war, his sentence was commuted on the condition that he be deported to Italy. This wasn't the only time the U.S. government relied on the Mafia for covert operations. Decades later, in the 1960s, intelligence agencies again turned to organized crime in an attempt to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro. The CIA recruited Mafia figures such as Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli, believing that their criminal networks could provide access to Cuban operatives. The plan ultimately failed, but it showcased the ongoing relationship between the U.S. government and organized crime, when strategic interests aligned. While Operation Underworld was never officially acknowledged until much later, the release of mobsters like Luciano demonstrated the government's willingness to make deals with criminals in times of national crisis. Critics argue that this partnership only strengthened the Mafia's grip on the country, as figures like Luciano continued to exert influence long after their supposed exile. Even after being deported to Italy, Luciano remained involved in international drug trafficking and organized crime, proving that his early release came with long-term consequences. These cases illustrate a recurring pattern in U.S. history: the government's willingness to look past criminal records when national security is at stake. Whether it was Nazi scientists or Mafia bosses, the pursuit of strategic advantage often led to decisions that blurred the lines between justice and pragmatism. The Cold War spy swap: Soviet agents exchanged for Americans. During the height of the Cold War, espionage was a high-stakes game played between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations arrested enemy spies, but rather than letting them rot in prison, they often became bargaining chips for the return of their own captured operatives. One of the most famous cases occurred in 1962 when the U.S. government exchanged a notorious Soviet spy, Rudolph Abel, for Francis Gary Powers, an American U-2 pilot who had been shot down over the Soviet Union. Abel, a Soviet intelligence officer operating under deep cover in the United States, had spent nearly a decade gathering classified information before being arrested by the FBI in 1957. Convicted of espionage, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. But rather than letting Abel serve out his time, the U.S. saw an opportunity when Powers was captured by the Soviets in 1960 after his U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down. The incident had embarrassed the U.S. and heightened Cold War tensions, as it exposed America's secret surveillance missions over Soviet airspace. For months, back-channel negotiations took place, leading to an agreement for a prisoner exchange. The swap took place on February 10, 1962, at the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, a location that would later become famous for Cold War spy trades. Abel, who had spent 5 years in U.S. custody, was handed over to Soviet officials, while Powers was returned to the United States. The exchange was a moment of high drama, symbolizing the secret diplomacy and calculated risks that defined Cold War intelligence operations. Despite being freed, both men faced scrutiny upon their return. Abel was welcomed as a hero in the Soviet Union, though some intelligence officials doubted his effectiveness. Powers, on the other hand, was initially criticized in the U.S. for not destroying his plane before capture, leading to accusations that he had compromised national security. Eventually, he was cleared of wrongdoing and later worked as a test pilot before his untimely death in a helicopter crash. The U.S.-Soviet spy swaps didn't end with Abel and Powers. Similar deals occurred throughout the Cold War, including the 1986 release of Soviet dissident Anatoly Shcharansky in exchange for convicted Soviet spies. Even in recent times, spy swaps remain a tool of diplomacy, proving that nations will always find ways to negotiate when their own agents are at stake. Operation Underworld: gangsters recruited to protect U.S. ports. During World War II, the United States faced a major security threat along its own shores. German submarines were sinking American ships just off the East Coast, and fears of enemy sabotage ran high. The military and intelligence agencies suspected that Axis spies might be operating in U.S. ports, particularly in New York. But rather than relying solely on law enforcement, the government turned to an unexpected ally: the Mafia. The U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, secretly enlisted the help of top gangsters, including Charles "Lucky" Luciano, in a covert operation known as Operation Underworld. The goal was simple: use the Mafia's influence to secure the docks and root out potential saboteurs. Organized crime had long controlled the New York waterfront, So the Navy believed that tapping into this underworld network was the best way to ensure port security. At the time, Luciano was serving a lengthy prison sentence for running a prostitution ring. But behind bars, he still wielded considerable power over the criminal underworld. In exchange for his cooperation, Luciano was promised leniency, though the details were kept classified. He agreed to use his Mafia connections to enforce order on the docks, ensuring that no Axis spies could operate undetected. As a result, the waterfront became one of the most secure areas in the country during the war. One of the most significant moments in Operation Underworld came after the burning of the French ocean liner SS Normandy in 1942. The luxury ship, which had been seized by the U.S. government and was being converted into a troop carrier, caught fire while docked in New York Harbor. Authorities suspected sabotage, and this event further convinced naval intelligence that the Mafia's involvement was necessary to prevent future disasters. Luciano's efforts paid off, and after the war his prison sentence was commuted by New York Governor Thomas Dewey. However, there was a catch. Luciano was forced to accept deportation to Italy, even though he had lived in the United States for most of his life. Once in Italy, Luciano continued to operate as a major figure in international organized crime, helping establish global heroin trafficking routes. The deal between the U.S. government and the Mafia raised serious ethical questions. While it may have contributed to wartime security, it also demonstrated how quickly the government was willing to compromise its stance on crime when it suited national interests. The operation also reinforced the Mafia's power, allowing figures like Luciano to retain their influence even after being expelled from the country. Operation Underworld remained classified for decades, but when it was finally revealed, it became one of the most infamous examples of the U.S. government cutting deals with criminals for the sake of security. It proved that even the most hardened gangsters could become valuable assets when the stakes were high enough. The Iran-Contra cover-up, pardons for key conspirators. The Iran-Contra affair was one of the biggest political scandals of the 1980s, exposing a secret U.S. operation that involved selling arms to Iran, a country officially designated as a state sponsor of terrorism, and using the proceeds to fund anti-communist Contra rebels in Nicaragua. This was a direct violation of the Boland Amendment, a law passed by Congress to prevent U.S. involvement in Nicaragua's civil war. The scandal implicated top officials in the Reagan administration, many of whom were eventually convicted of serious crimes, including perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. But instead of serving their sentences, these officials were pardoned or had their convictions overturned, thanks to the U.S. government's desire to bury the controversy. One of the key figures in the scandal was Oliver North, a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps who played a major role in coordinating the illegal operation. North was found guilty of obstructing a congressional inquiry, destroying documents, and accepting illegal gratuities. He was sentenced to probation and community service, but his convictions were overturned on appeal due to concerns over tainted testimony from Congress. North ultimately avoided prison despite playing a central role in the scandal. Another major figure was John Poindexter, President Reagan's national security advisor, who was convicted of conspiracy, lying to Congress, and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison, but had his conviction overturned as well. Similarly, Elliott Abrams, a high-ranking official in the State Department, was convicted of withholding information from Congress, but he received only probation and a fine, and was later pardoned. The most blatant example of the government protecting its own came in 1992, when President George H.W. Bush issued full pardons to 6 key figures involved in the scandal, including former Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger. Weinberger had been charged with perjury and obstruction of justice for covering up details of the arms for hostages deal. The pardons ensured that no high-ranking official would face serious consequences for the operation. Critics saw these actions as a clear example of political elites being above the law. The pardons effectively ended any hope of further prosecutions, and as a result, many of the secrets surrounding Iran-Contra remained buried. The scandal showed that the U.S. government was willing to break its own laws in the name of foreign policy and then shield those responsible when they were caught. Even decades later, Iran-Contra remains one of the most controversial examples of high-level criminality being erased for political convenience. The CIA's drug lords, narcos-turned-informants. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the CIA and other U.S. intelligence agencies were engaged in covert operations around the world, particularly in Latin America. One of the most controversial aspects of these operations was the use of drug traffickers as informants and assets, sometimes allowing them to walk free or avoid prosecution in exchange for their cooperation. Some of the most notorious drug lords in history benefited from these secret deals, raising serious questions about the U.S. government's role in the global drug trade. One infamous case involved Manuel Noriega, the dictator of Panama, who had long been involved in drug trafficking. Noriega had been a paid CIA asset since the 1960s, providing intelligence on communist movements in Central America, while also helping facilitate U.S. operations in the region. Despite his well-documented connections to Colombian drug cartels, the U.S. turned a blind eye to his crimes for years because he was seen as a valuable ally against leftist insurgents. It wasn't until 1989, when Noriega's relationship with the U.S. soured, that the U.S. government suddenly decided he was a criminal. He was captured in a U.S. military invasion of Panama and later convicted of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. Another controversial case involved Freeway Rick Ross, a major cocaine trafficker in the United States whose drug empire was partly fueled by CIA-backed Nicaraguan Contras. Investigative journalist Gary Webb exposed the link between CIA operatives and cocaine smuggling in his groundbreaking series Dark Alliance, published in 1996. Webb revealed that U.S.-supported Nicaraguan Contras had been involved in smuggling massive amounts of cocaine into the U.S., which was then distributed by dealers like Ross. Despite overwhelming evidence, the government denied official involvement, and no high-ranking officials were ever prosecuted. Instead, Webb faced a backlash from the media and the government, and his reputation was systematically destroyed. The U.S. government's willingness to work with known drug traffickers extended beyond just Latin America. In the 1990s, it was revealed that the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, had allowed Mexican cartel leaders to operate freely in exchange for intelligence on rival drug lords. This meant that criminals responsible for smuggling thousands of tons of cocaine and heroin into the U.S. were essentially given a pass as long as they cooperated with American authorities. These cases expose the dark reality of U.S. foreign policy. When national security or intelligence objectives are at stake, even the most dangerous criminals can be seen as assets rather than enemies. Whether it was Noriega, the Nicaraguan Contras, or cartel informants, the U.S. government repeatedly chose to protect and even empower drug traffickers when it suited their interests. The consequences of these decisions have been devastating, fueling corruption, violence, and the expansion of the drug trade rather than containing it. The Guantanamo deals. Detainees traded for diplomacy. Since its establishment in 2002, the Guantanamo Bay detention camp has been one of the most controversial symbols of the U.S. government's war on terror. Officially used to hold the world's most dangerous terrorists, Guantanamo also became a place where detainees were imprisoned indefinitely without formal charges or trials. Over the years, multiple prisoners were quietly released, not necessarily because they were innocent, but because the U.S. government found it politically or diplomatically convenient to do so. One of the most well-known instances of this occurred in 2014, when the U.S. exchanged 5 high-ranking Taliban leaders held at Guantanamo in return for U.S. Army Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, an American soldier who had been captured by the Taliban-aligned Haqqani network in Afghanistan. The trade, often referred to as the Taliban 5 deal, was brokered as part of a larger diplomatic effort between the U.S. and the Taliban, with Qatar acting as a mediator. The 5 Taliban members, Mohammad Fazl, Nurullah Nouri, Khairullah Khairkhwa, Abdul Haq Wasik, and Mohammad Nabi Omari, were considered some of the most dangerous individuals in U.S. custody, accused of planning and executing terrorist attacks against both Afghan and American forces. Critics of the deal argued that these men would inevitably return to the battlefield, strengthening the Taliban just as the U.S. was preparing to withdraw from Afghanistan. And that's exactly what happened. Several of the released detainees went on to assume key positions in the Taliban government after the U.S. withdrawal in 2021. Khairullah Khairkhwa, for instance, became the acting Minister of Information and Culture in the Taliban's new regime. The trade raised serious ethical and strategic concerns, with many questioning whether the U.S. had just made a deal that would ultimately lead to more violence and instability. The Taliban 5 exchange wasn't the only instance where Guantanamo detainees were released for political reasons. Over the years, multiple prisoners were transferred to other countries under secret agreements, often in exchange for security cooperation or diplomatic favors. For example, the Obama administration sought to close Guantanamo by gradually transferring detainees to foreign nations, sometimes making deals with countries like Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates to take in former prisoners. While some of these detainees were considered low risk, others had direct ties to terrorist networks. The concern was that once released, they would rejoin militant groups and continue their activities. Reports from U.S. intelligence agencies indicated that a significant number of former Guantanamo detainees returned to terrorism after their release. A 2017 report from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, ODNI, estimated that nearly 30% of released detainees had re-engaged in extremist activities. The issue of releasing Guantanamo prisoners remains a sensitive and complex topic. On one hand, holding individuals indefinitely without trial contradicts American legal principles. On the other, the risk of releasing individuals who may return to terrorism puts national security at stake. The Guantanamo deals demonstrate how, when faced with political and diplomatic pressures, the U.S. government is willing to take risks that may have long-term consequences. Whether these deals ultimately served American interests remains a matter of intense debate.